correspondent in Manila, Howard Johnson, sent this report.
High winds and heavy rain have been battering Mindanao for the last 48 hours as Tropical Storm Vinta makes its way across the country. Local reports say a farming village on the north of the island has been entirely buried by a mudslide. Floodwaters also hit Marawi, the war-torn city that's still recovering after 5 months of fighting between the so-called Islamic State-inspired Mauti group and government forces. Camps in nearby towns for those displaced by the war have been destroyed. Officials say evacuees have been moved to covered sports centres. The Philippine National Disaster Council had worked preemptively to move residents in landslide and flood-prone areas to shelter.
Well, the priority right now is to rescue, and then we're taking care of the evacuation. So we've already provided water and hot food, and we're going to be distributing non-food items, certainly blankets, mosquito nets, and certainly hygiene kits for those who are in evacuation centers, and so that we could alleviate the suffering of many of the folks there.
The Philippines is hit by around 20 typhoons every year, bringing death and destruction to some of the poorest communities in the country. Tropical Storm Vinta is now headed towards the popular tourist island Palawan, where it's expected to intensify with winds of up to 120 kilometers per hour. Howard Johnson, BBC News, Manila, in the Philippines.
Well, as Howard mentioned there, Storm Vinta, which is the local name for Storm Tembin, is moving southwest towards Palawan, where residents have been warned of possible flash floods and landslides. Earlier, I spoke to Andrew Morris, who's the head of UNICEF's Mindanao field office. He explained more about what's happening on the ground.
Typhoon Vinta reached the east coast of Mindanao and in the last 2 days traversed across to the west. Gusts of winds more than 100 miles an hour, flash floods and landslides, and while the population in the east of Mindanao seem to have been a little bit better prepared, some moving into evacuation centres, the provinces north of North Mindanao, particularly Lanao del Sur, have been particularly affected. Yesterday, winds of 70, 80 miles per hour, and Lanao del Sur province is the poorest in the Philippines. And in the past 7 months, there have been around 350,000 people displaced in that province because of fighting, because of conflict, and some 20,000 of those living in tents for the past 7 months. So the priority yesterday and this morning has really been to check their situation, and thankfully less than 100 people had to move from their tents to alternative accommodation. There's been interruption of electricity supplies. Water for those displaced families is often from pumped water, and the electricity stops the pumps from working. So our partners on the ground are trying to quickly, with the local authorities, put that right. But outside of those evacuation centres, the situation seems to be much worse. And there are around 10 districts, municipalities, very, very badly affected. And we've seen some of the media pictures earlier. We're hoping that in the next day, the water will recede very quickly. Over the next 2 days, our staff and our partners will be in those areas looking to see what the immediate needs are. But of course, in this situation, there are big risks for children, risks of outbreaks of diarrhea, waterborne diseases. The sanitation situation in those affected areas in North Mindanao have been particularly bad, and this has added risks. So we think that water sanitation needs will be a particular priority.
Andrew Morris there, the head of UNICEF's field office in Mindanao in the Philippines. And you can find out much more on this story on our website, including a look at how countries can cope with natural disasters. Just log on to bbc.com/news. The United Nations Security Council has passed new sanctions on North Korea that will cut oil supplies seen as vital for Pyongyang's missile and nuclear programs. The measures, which were drafted by the US, also force North Koreans working overseas to return home. North Korea has yet to respond, but last month called for an end to what it described as brutal sanctions. Well, Donald Trump has welcomed the sanctions. He tweeted that the Security Council had approved them unanimously, and he added that the world wants peace, not death. The United Nations has for the first time begun flying vulnerable African refugees being